Well, last week we started this series by looking at two very different feasts. The first feast was the feast for Herod's birthday at his palace. And the second feast was the informal feast in the wilderness where Jesus feeds the 5,000. And these two feast stories are put side by side as a way of helping us compare and contrast the way of life that Jesus invites us to and the way of life that Herod's empire forces us into. And if you recall, the way of Herod, which represents the socioeconomic and political systems of our world, is one where ego and power and status and violence is championed. It's valued above all else. It's a system that tells us that we don't have to take into account the well-being of our neighbor or the person who lives on the other side of the world or the creation that we are entrusted to care for. So this week, we are going to be looking at the story of Jesus calming the waters because it builds off of these two feast stories and is probably more connected than you would initially think. But before we move on, let's pray. God, we ask that you would, as we open ourselves up to your scriptures, that you would move in us to produce wisdom and conviction and encouragement. We thank you that as a community, we get to look through this beautiful story and see how it will impact our lives. Amen. So if you remember last week, just by way of recap, but before the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000, the disciples, they want to get away for some rest. They are tired and weary, and so Jesus wants them to get away. He wants them to recharge. Does anybody feel like that this morning? Just a little bit. Yeah, I see those hands. Jeff has some praise hands going on in the back, just saying yes. Yeah, we've all felt like that, so I think we get this. But as the story goes, what was once an isolated place that Jesus is taking his disciples to quickly becomes a not so isolated place as the crowds rush to where Jesus is. They want to hear him teach. They want to hear about his vision for a world made right. They want to hear about God's kingdom, which is the alternative to Herod's empire. So Jesus begins to teach, and the teaching goes on late into the afternoon. So Jesus' disciples come to Jesus and say, Jesus, it's getting late. Go send the crowds away to get some food. But Jesus has something else in mind. Remember, Jesus is speaking to an impoverished and exploited peasant class. And so it's not just words that Jesus wants to give them, but actual food. For Jesus, and I hope for us as well, God's kingdom is about tangible difference in the world. Yes? Actual tangible difference. And if you think about the Lord's Prayer, and feel free to say it along with me if you would like, it goes, Our Father who is in heaven, holy is your name, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. The petition of God's kingdom coming to earth as it is in heaven is followed by the actual giving of food to the impoverished. So Jesus wants the crowds to have bread, and so what he does is he sends out the disciples to go see how much bread they can find, and they come back with 5 loaves and 2 fish, to which I still find it funny that Jesus asks for bread, and the disciples come back with bread and fish. I think it was that overachieving disciple, that Enneagram 3 disciple who was like, I'm going to bring fish as well, Jesus. I want to show you how much I love you. Well, we know the story that after all the food is distributed, everyone is fed. And this impoverished and malnourished group is left without need. And the beautiful, profound, captivating image is this, that when the hands of Jesus give out bread, food, Everyone has enough. When Herod distributes food, only those who can afford it receive. But when God distributes food, there is an abundance. It's really a euphoric scene. It's what the Hebrew prophets, they dreamed of. I think of Isaiah chapter 25, and Ben, you can throw it up on the screen. It's one of those anthem verses for the Hebrew people because they saw the world around them. They cried out for God to do something different. And so the prophet Isaiah speaks this vision into reality. It says, "On this mountain the Lord Almighty will prepare a feast of rich food for all peoples, a banquet of aged wine, the best of meats and the finest of wines. On this mountain he will destroy the shroud that enfolds all peoples, the sheet that covers all nations. He will swallow up death forever. The sovereign Lord will wipe away the tears from all faces. He will remove his people's disgrace from all the earth. The Lord has spoken." This feeding of the 5,000 is a big deal. And I think about the disciples who are exhausted. They're sort of like Jeff right now. And in the midst of that, their adrenaline is pumping because God's kingdom is here, right? How could you not feel untouchable and exuberant in that moment? But now as the story continues, we read that Jesus sends his disciples back to their boat and he goes to dismiss the crowds. And once everybody leaves, Jesus goes up on the mountainside and begins to pray. And we are told that as the night goes on, Jesus looks out to see that his disciples are struggling to gain momentum. They are channeling their inner little engine that could, and they are rowing and rowing and rowing, but they've only been able to make it halfway across the lake. Remember, they are exhausted, and now with the winds against them, they are agonizing. The word that the gospel writer uses to actually describe this agony is the Greek word for torture. It's almost as if he wants to get this image across to us that the winds are becoming personified, that they are harassing and tormenting the disciples. The winds are pressing in on them, and they can't do anything but row their boat not so gently down the stream. Liam would be proud right now. I think it's fair to say that we've all been in situations where we've metaphorically been rowing all night. Yeah? Fair to say? Maybe it's a season where the boat of our life is being harassed by winds. And these winds can be anything, right? And I mean anything. They can be financial trouble, challenges in relationships, the experience of loss, dealing with lots of change, struggling with a mental or physical illness, living with consequences of a bad decision, or I'm going to throw one out there, maybe a global pandemic. We all have and will have times where all we can do is just row and wonder, when is this going to end? Seriously. It's hard to go through a crisis. It's hard to be put in times of struggle, of suffering where we feel vulnerable. And I think especially within the Western world, we struggle with this because we are told that we need to shape our entire lives around avoiding suffering and securing comfort. The way of Herod is to orchestrate everything in our life to avoid suffering. It's to hold on to the status quo of comfort and convenience. It wants us to grasp power so that we can avoid all of the compromising, vulnerable times in our life. And I think we subtly start to believe that we can actually control the outcome of things. As I started to look back in the Gospel of Mark, I realized that up until this point, the disciples had exercised their faith in a particular way. It was all arms, no legs, if you're used to working out. They had seen Jesus do incredible things like heal the sick, perform miracles like feeding 5,000, and they themselves had been able to do incredible things like heal the sick. But here in this moment, they are experiencing suffering. They are vulnerable. And instead of being the ones in control, they are actually the ones who are in an uncontrollable crisis. I think what's happening is up until this point, they've only been formed in their spiritual journey in a comfortable environment. The kingdom of God lived out in their lives had been one where they've been able to hold the control. There was no vulnerability to their faith or learning how it is an anchor in the midst of a crisis. I think this quote by Brené Brown helps us to think through the process of what the disciples were going through. She says this, "I wanted faith to work like an epidural, to numb the pain of vulnerability. As it turned out, my faith ended up being more like a midwife, a nurturing partner who leans into the discomfort with me and whispers, 'Push and breathe.' Faith didn't make my life less vulnerable or comfortable. It simply offered to travel with me through the uncertainty." Do you hear what she's saying? She desperately wanted her faith to take away the struggle of life. She wanted her faith to save her from the vulnerable, troubling, and challenging times that she faced. Instead, she began to learn that her faith was more like a faithful companion who was journeying with her through the uncertain, challenging times and encouraging her during it. What we're going to see in this story is that the way of Jesus needs to be lived out in the easy and the hard times for it to mean something. It's in the comfortable and the uncomfortable, the vulnerable and the resilient moments where an authentic faith is formed. And why is this so important? Why is this so important? Because Herod's kingdom is both enticing and intimidating, and it takes faith and courage to push back and choose the way of Jesus. And as we push back, it is hard. It's not an easy thing to do. We put ourselves in compromising situations, and we make decisions not to make our lives more carefree and more comfortable, but we actually put ourselves in uncomfortable situations as we move to love those around us. Let's go back to the story now. As the story continues, we are told that Jesus went out to the disciples walking on the water, and he was about to pass by them, but then they saw Jesus and they were terrified. They thought that he was a spirit being, an apparition. In ancient times, bodies of water were eerie and mysterious, and it was a common superstition in the time of Jesus that those who died, in the water or on the water or whatnot, those who met their demise in the water would often come back to that place. Their souls would come back to that place. And so Jesus, wanting to relieve them from this terror, speaks to them and says, "Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid." Now, I think this scene is pretty funny. You might not, and that's okay, but at least I think it's funny. And what makes it funny for me is that phrase, "and Jesus was about to pass by them." I think about the disciples rowing like madmen, and Jesus just nonchalantly walking by and waving and greeting them with a casual nod. But for the original readers, that phrase, "pass them by," wouldn't have been funny. It's not like what we think when we read that, "pass them by." We think Jesus is, tailing them behind them in a car, and he hits the left express lane to blow by them. That's not what it is. It's more of the language of Jesus as a runway model. That's an image. Jesus as a runway model, going down the runway and revealing a new look to the onlookers. It's actually specifically the language of a grand reveal. In other words, Jesus was using this as an opportunity to reveal himself to them. And there's double meaning in this. Yes, he's revealing himself to them as one who is in their midst, in the midst of their suffering, but one who is also able and ultimately able to calm the waters. Walking on water was something that the Hebrew scriptures claimed only God could do. And so Jesus is revealing to the disciples that he is God, that he is God with them. And because he is God with them, he is inviting them into something incredibly different as they follow him. And as I was thinking about this, what stood out to me and what made me puzzled was, didn't this already happen? You would think this grand reveal of Jesus being God would have already happened. You look back and Jesus is doing incredible things like healing the sick and casting out demons and feeding 5,000 people. And you're like, hold on a second. Like, wouldn't this grand reveal already have happened? Here's what Mark tells us. We are told that as Jesus steps into the boat, the wind and the waves calm, and this leaves the disciples amazed. And the word here for amazed is not like, whoa, Jesus, that's so cool, like cool party trick, Jesus. It's more to be so utterly confused that you're knocked backwards, that you're knocked off your feet. And Mark says that their confusion lies in the fact that they couldn't understand the loaves and the meaning behind it because their hearts were hard. And as I read that, I was reminded that it's often in the hard times that we learn things that we wouldn't otherwise learn. Hard times open us up to be more empathetic, more generous, and more kind. And they also tend to destabilize the status quo, the assumptions that we are believing, like the fact that we can control everything. And in that, we often check ourselves. And we check the priorities that we have. We check the lifestyle that we're living. See, the disciples, they didn't get the significance of who Jesus was in the euphoria of Jesus feeding the 5,000. That was not the grand reveal for them. But now, in the midst of suffering, this grand reveal is happening. They see him for who he is and what he is inviting them into. As human beings, I think it's fair to say that we don't embrace suffering well. We are drawn towards the status quo. The human experience is to resist the idea of a faith formed in crisis. And trust me, I get this. As I'm sharing this message, I hope that you don't think I'm sharing it as one who has gone through lots of suffering and trials. I'm not. But I think we can all connect with the reality that we want to avoid the difficult things. We want to pass over them, not embrace them, and certainly not choose to enter into them. As human beings, we have as much success embracing struggle as if you were to sign me up for the Boston Marathon and tell me to run. It would not be a good scene whatsoever. EMS would have to be called immediately. Yet without moments of struggle in our faith journey, we run the risk of thinking that suffering or being uncomfortable isn't a part of following Jesus. And it seems silly, right? Again, we look at the life of Jesus. We look at how he entered into suffering willingly. We look at how he consistently put himself in vulnerable times. But yet, when we go through times that are vulnerable or uncomfortable or challenging, we tend to take them personally. I was thinking about some low-key examples of struggling, and I started to laugh. So let's take a look at a few. Your internet doesn't work for the day. Your car doesn't start. You've been waiting to talk to customer service for an hour. You lose your wallet. Your takeout order is wrong. You have to work an extra shift because your coworker is absent. your kids are sick for 2 weeks and throw off all of your plans and keep you up at night and get you sick. I don't know where I got that example from. And they seem silly, right? They seem silly, but when they happen, we are cheesed. We are cheesed. We take it so personally, and our reaction is either to blow up or to shut down and withdraw. Again, I get it. We have been so conditioned by the status quo of Herod's kingdom that when we experience suffering or vulnerability, our ego flares up faster than an old sports injury. And here is the big takeaway. These moments of struggle are actually a gift. And you're like, don't say that, Michael. Don't say that. Here's the reason, and I think it's 2 reasons baked into one. One, they help us live in the moment, and we are really bad at that. And secondly, they help us refuse to fall victim to a once I'm better or a once this passes or when I'm in a different place type of faith. Maybe I can bring it home with this. This pandemic continues to challenge us. I think that's fair to say. It puts us in hard spots, and it seems like daily we are given the opportunity or we're put in the situation where we can either choose to push through or sort of just wait it out. And if I'm not careful, I can convince myself that my spiritual formation can hit the pause button. That I can hit the pause button until things are back to normal. And I can tell myself that it's okay to coast because it's either too hard to connect with community or there are just more stressors in my life or I've been patient enough. And the truth is that there's probably some truth in all of those different things. But what happens is I end up justifying my reaction to suffering. And when I do that, I allow myself and suffering to disorient me. And when it disorients me, what happens is I no longer am producing the fruit of the Spirit. Instead, I'm having anger produced in me, and impatience, and withdrawal, and boredom, and disappointment, and anxiety. And that's not good for me. That's not good for the people around me, like Teresa and my family. And it's not good for the world that I am entrusted to care for. It's not good in the struggle against Herod's kingdom. As soon as we fall victim to a once I'm better or a once this passes or a once I'm in a different spot faith, we replace the faith that Jesus invited us into for a cheap replica made in the image of Herod. But if we choose to reject the once I'm better or once this passes or once I'm in a different spot type of faith, we have an opportunity to really trust that suffering actually gives more than it takes. That the invitation to choose weakness and vulnerability and discomfort, that in that invitation we follow the example of Jesus, who embraced suffering as a way to conquer death and actually extend life to others. As we say yes to trials that come into our life, God promises us something. He promises us that it won't be in vain, that He will always use that as an opportunity to produce in us fruit. For me, recently it's been patience and gentleness and meekness and kindness, and I don't say that because I've figured out how to be meek or gentle, but I've been put in situations where I have to choose. I have to choose to either hit the pause button on my spiritual formation and check out, or say, yes, I'm actually going to open myself up in this moment to be transformed by Jesus. So please hear this. If you've heard that times of suffering are really just an opportunity for you to clench your jaw and to push through alone. That's not what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is that this is an invitation to live in God's kingdom, surrounded by a community who will support you, knowing that God is near and invested in your life, and there's lots of grace because this is a process. See, like us, the disciples were on a journey to a well-formed faith. And the reason that they were on this journey is because Jesus was shaping them. He was shaping them to be able to resist the temptation and intimidation of Herod's kingdom. And it wasn't until they understood Jesus' death that they really got it. If God's kingdom coming to earth happens most clearly when the God who can walk on water and calm the seas willingly enters into suffering as a way of exposing the useless kingdom of Herod, as we sign ourselves up to be apprentices of Jesus and follow him, we are going to be in vulnerable, uncomfortable, challenging times as well. If we truly want to combat and push against the status quo, we are going to be in uncomfortable times. And so we need to be reminded that it's not bad. It's actually a gift. We don't need to take it personally. We don't need to have our ego flare up. Richard Rohr reminds us that we are all tempted to expect resurrection without death. We are all tempted to expect resurrection without death. We want the reality of God's kingdom, our inner transformation and our world's outer transformation, without the death to our ego and without the sacrifices that it takes to actually make a difference in the world around us. It's hard. It's hard. It's a temptation, again, that we are all going to be living through. So what do we do? What do we do? And this is not me wrapping it up in a bow. I think it takes deep wrestling. But a good place to start is to pray. Because prayer changes us. Throughout this week, I've been reflecting on this message, and I wanted to write a prayer for myself as a way to process through this challenge, this call to resist the status quo, and to actually enter into an uncomfortable living in order to bring God's kingdom to earth. And this is the prayer that I wrote. And what I want you to do is just to take a few minutes in reflection and read through the prayer. Just wrestle with it for a little bit. And then at the very end, I'm going to invite you to pray it with me if that's something that you would like. So I'll just leave you now to read the prayer. So I've been reflecting on that. I'd love to pray it together. And so just where you are, I'm going to read through it and see what pings. Jesus, I admit that it is easy to make, when things change, my mantra for spiritual formation. I confess that comfort, convenience, and control are so attractive, and that the status quo is so appealing. I acknowledge that suffering is difficult and that choosing to embrace vulnerability is demanding. It demands my time, my energy, my possessions, my priorities, my relationships, all that I value and hold tightly to. I feel weak, afraid, and overwhelmed just thinking about it. Letting go is hard for me. And in the midst of all these thoughts and feelings, I know you know these things about me. They do not frustrate or intimidate you. Just as you were present with your disciples, teaching and demonstrating your nearness, you too are willing to teach and show me. So I pray, thank you for my suffering, for it reveals your strength in me. Thank you for this struggle, for it produces your Spirit's fruit in my life. Thank you for my discomfort, for it signals that I am seeking your kingdom. Amen. Your homework this week, if you want homework, is to read this prayer every day slowly and to wrestle with it. You can get creative. You could record yourself reading this and then play it when you're driving in the car. Just think about it. I know this is going to be a challenge. And we can get intimidated by something like this because we feel like we'll never be able to measure up. We'll never be able to actually make a difference. That prayer can't actually be true in our life. And when that starts to seep in, my prayer for you is that you would hear the words of Jesus. Take courage. It is I. Do not be afraid. Thank you for being on this journey with me. I'm excited to wrap up the teaching series next week as it goes more from internal to reflecting on us as a church. For all of you, just know that you are loved deeply and truly. Have a great week.